I will be the moderator for tonight's debate. Other people are around the country tonight debating Trump and Clinton. Others might be Cubs, Dodgers. We, gentlemen, are going to settle what's the best business school in the world tonight.
It's going to be great. It's going to be great, believe me.
And Frank and I are feeling pretty confident. So all kidding aside, it's a special event to be able to have Harvard and Kellogg and University of Chicago booth. Not only to have three professors here, but obviously the alumni groups, and we'd like to really thank the alumni clubs and the universities and all of you for coming out and having a united event. We're really excited about that, so we're thrilled. And tonight's an interesting topic, right? Sales strategies to drive profitable growth, which is a topic that a lot of us, depending on if you're running companies, may or may not know a lot about. When I was at HBS in the mid-90s, I did 503 case studies in 2 years. And Frank, how many do you think were on sales?
The half dozen I read.
Which didn't make it to the classes I was in, by the way. Literally, it wasn't in the curriculum, which is kind of interesting. And a lot has progressed. And we're going to talk about kind of why this is becoming much more of a must-have in a management science, something that's studied, and hopefully something that can be replicated and learned, some tricks of the trade for all of you tonight. So listen, the way it's going to work is I'm going to now introduce our three panelists. I'll go through and introduce them, and then they each have prepared about 15 minutes or so, some opening comments, and they'll share some of their research, some of their perspectives. And at that point, once they're all three done, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So probably about a 45-minute discussion. I definitely have a lot of questions as well, and then we'll mostly be getting questions from the audience. So think through what you might want to be asking these guys. So let me introduce our esteemed panel. Right here we have Frank Cespedes, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, who came in for the event. Frank teaches entrepreneurial sales and marketing. He also heads the executive program on linking strategy and sales. Also teaches in the owner-president management program, OPM. We have any OPMers here? All right. Which is specially designed for CEOs. While at Harvard, Frank has written many publications and has been featured in Harvard Business Review, California Management Review, Organization Science, the Wall Street Journal. He's written 6 books. His most recent is called Aligning Strategy and Sales: The Choices, Systems, and Behaviors That Drive Effective Selling. It was published by the Harvard Business Review Press, and it was called a must-read by Gartner. Forbes said perhaps the best sales book ever. I don't know if Dan and I and Craig were thinking it's probably the 3rd or 4th, but it was good. It was good. All kidding aside, actually, it is fantastic. And before becoming a professor, what I most respect, and having listened to Frank and different alumni forums, Frank ran a business for many years, and so has really kind of done this. He combines the research with actually the practitioner. He was managing partner at the Center for Executive Development, which had won many awards in the United States and throughout Europe. He also consults a lot of companies and works a lot with private equity and venture capital investors. Has been a board member of Evenflow, Halo Industries, many startup firms, and the Education for Employment Foundation. He has his BA from City College of New York, an MS from MIT, which means he's actually smart. The Harvard guys will laugh at that. And a PhD from Cornell University. So welcome, Frank Cespedes. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And representing Kellogg, we have Dan Weinfurter, who's also who's recently been an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Kellogg School of Management. He's currently the CEO of GrowthPlay, so he's our host tonight. Thank you, Dan. GrowthPlay, for those of you who haven't yet heard, is an integrated sales effectiveness services business that's backed by Driehaus Private Equity. It's focused on helping organizations improve their ability to drive profitable revenue growth. In his 25 years as a serial entrepreneur, Dan has built 3 prior private equity-backed companies from startup to considerable scale, including the Parsing Group, which landed as the #1 on the coveted Inc. 500 list of fastest-growing private companies. He started his career at General Electric, He was hired into their sales training program upon graduation from college. He spent 8 years at GE in 4 different U.S. cities. He is the author of Second Stage Entrepreneurship, 10 Proven Strategies to Drive Aggressive Growth, also tied for the 3rd or 4th best business book. He has a BS and an MBA from Marquette University, so I'm guessing you're very excited about Dwayne Wade joining the Bulls, I'm guessing, right? Marquette guy. Good day. And is a member of the Economic Club of Chicago. So thank you for hosting, and thanks for being here, Dan. Hello, everybody. And then finally, we have Craig Wortmann, who is representing University of Chicago booth. Oh, we got some booth folks. Craig is an author, a booth professor, and an entrepreneur. He is the CEO of Sales Engine, which is a firm that helps companies build and tune their sales engine. That's a good name for your company. In addition to serving as the CEO for 3 different companies prior to that, he's been a clinical professor of entrepreneurship at the Chicago Booth School for many years. His MBA course, called Entrepreneurial Selling, was ranked top 10 in the country by Inc. magazine. And Craig also won the Faculty Excellence Award given by students to the professor who has had the most impact on them. Craig's book, called What's Your Story?, looks at how leaders use stories to influence performance, and he delivers these ideas in talks and workshops all over the world. And finally, Craig has launched, just recently, Chicago Booth's first ever online course called Sales Strategies, Mastering the Selling Process. And people from all over the globe are tuning in to that great course. So please help me welcome Craig Wortmann. So great. So what we're going to do is Frank's going to make some comments as it relates to thinking about company-wide, C-level executives and sales forces, and thinking about that alignment. And then Dan's going to talk specifically about the sales kind of organization, and as a leader, what are some of the levers you can pull. And then Craig's going to talk about sort of some of the very important execution components, particularly around storytelling and how we can teach our sellers really to be effective and translate all the things you're going to hear Dan and Frank talk about. So we're really glad you're here, and I'll hand it over to Frank.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna try to use this if this works. I'm also not gonna stay up here because if I do, I'll fall and make a fool of myself. But it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I say that, not only because obviously that's the sort of thing you're supposed to say at the beginning of sessions like this, but it is good, no joking aside, to have multiple business school alumni. That doesn't happen, and the reason it doesn't happen is because if you think lead generation is important in SaaS, you have no idea how alumni donations works. True story. Last month was, there's a weekend at Harvard Business School every September. It's the alumni reunions. I was a speaker. I was talking with a fellow who graduated about 15 years ago. He's one of these people who came straight from the military academy to business school. And then as Iraq heated up, he got posted there because he still had military duties. And he told me, true story, he was in, wherever it is, Podunk, Iraq. He said, my mother didn't know where I was. There were people in the United States who were not supposed to know where I was. And in the mail was a letter from Harvard Business School asking for a donation. So this is not common, all right? I'm going to begin, as Ryan said, talking a little bit about linking strategy and sales, and in classic business school fashion, I'm going to begin simply by throwing numbers at you. Globally, as far as I can tell, based on the data I can find, firms spend about $100 billion on consulting that is allegedly about strategy. Now one of the complaints that some people have about business schools is that that's who we cater to. Well, it's a $100 billion business. You can see why. But here's the really interesting number. US firms alone spend about $900 billion annually. Annually means every year, right? about $900 billion annually on sales. That's not marketing. That's sales SG&A, the compensation to salespeople, travel and entertainment, the allied expenses, et cetera. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's about 3 times what US companies spend on all their advertising media, Super Bowl ads, everything. It's more than 15 times what they spend on digital this and digital that, and it's more than 30 times their current spend on social media, although if you read the press, you would think the proportions are the opposite. On average, across industries, it's about 10% of revenues that goes to selling efforts. And obviously, as many people here know, that's a bigger percentage in a lot of B2B businesses. Now, when I see numbers like that, I'm always reminded of a phrase that's attributed to Mark Twain. If you're going to put a lot of eggs in one basket, keep your eyes on that damn basket, all right? Now, if we do that, let's have the next slide. If we keep our eyes on that basket, here's what we see, a few more numbers. Linking strategy and sales is by far, for most companies, the biggest part of strategy execution. That's what the previous slide tells us. But just some numbers. There's a company in Europe, headquartered in Europe, called Effectory. They're basically the European version of the Gallup organization. And every year, for years, Effectory does a survey. And it's a very good survey. It gets about 300,000 responses every year. And they send it out to companies across sectors around the world, different levels. And one of their questions in the survey every year is, do you, the employee, do you understand your company's strategy? No, fair question, right? Less than 50% of employees say, yes, I do, which means more than 50% say, I don't have a clue. But here's the really interesting and perverse part. The closer you get to the customer, in other words, when you cut the Effectory data and say, what are the responses from people in sales and service, the percentage who say, I understand, goes down. It doesn't go up. I mean, it's hard to execute something you don't understand. That's the data. Maricon, one of these consulting firms that takes return on invested capital seriously, as I hope you do. What their research says is that on average, firms deliver only about 50 to 60% of the financial performance that they promise in their strategies and sales forecasts. Now, if you want to know why the people here who work in investment firms and private equity tend to be a cynical, hard-bitten lot, this is why. That's right. But this is why. I mean, they're constantly dealing with folks who overpromise and underdeliver. That is what that data says. Booze. Almost 3 out of 5 executives say their biggest challenge is allocating resources in line with their strategy. Now, I don't want to sound like the business school wise guy, but when I look at that, I say to myself, well, how do you allocate resources? I mean, do you cut up a chicken, look at the entrails, you roll dice? I mean, think about this. If we take these numbers seriously. And then finally, a very good McKinsey study. And if you think about the Great Recession, intuitively, you can see what's going on here. What's happened is that in the past decade, the S&P 500 has, in the aggregate, cut its cost of goods sold by about 300 basis points. That's a lot. When you add up what that means, that's about $1 trillion, for obvious reasons, given what happened starting in 2008. But sales and SG&A have increased as a percentage of sales. Basically, what companies have done in our economy is give them credit. They've done a damn good job in the back office with shared services, with operations, Six Sigma, yada, yada, yada. There's a shifting focus of productivity efforts, and it's about the go-to-market. And the reason it's about the go-to-market is for the same reason that Willie Sutton robbed banks, because that's where the money is. That is what this data tells you. So again, a number of numbers. Now, what causes this problem? A couple of factors. One is, dirty secret in many businesses, they don't have a strategy. They've got mission statements, they have purpose, they have all this other stuff, but they don't have a strategy. It is tough to do sustained good things in business without a strategy. It really is. It is possible to get lucky. People do all the time, especially in Silicon Valley, Ryan. But it's tough to do sustained good things. The typical planning process now takes, according to the research, about 5 to 6 months. Now think about what that means. For 5 to 6 months, the company's doing strategic planning. Meanwhile, sales has to respond account by account, issue by issue. So even if the end result of that process is a great strategy, and obviously that's a big if, it's often simply irrelevant to the people in the field. If you ask yourself, why does a factory find these results consistently? So few people understand their company's direction. If you ask the C-level why this is, by far the most common response is, we don't want our competitors to know. That is a bogus answer. You got much bigger problems than competitors knowing your strategy if your own people don't know it, and yet this is the common rationalization. Changes in the composition of the C-suite, very good piece of research done by a colleague of mine. In the last 25 years, the average number of executives reporting to the CEO has doubled, twice as much. But if you look at who these people are, very, very few of them are what we would call general managers, responsible for P&L at a business unit, et cetera. It's the CMO, the CFO, the CIO, general counsel. Why is that? Business is more complex. It takes more to stay on top of specialist knowledge, but the C-suite is increasingly siloed, and many of them simply don't know that much about sales. Take a guess. How many CEOs in the Fortune 500 today, as we speak, came up through the sales route in their company? Anybody know what that number is?
0.
No, you're a pessimist. 1. Chuck Robbins of Cisco is the only one, right? So there is a gap here. There is an existential gap. Sales metrics and compensation plan incentives. Most salespeople are bonus simply on what they sell, volume, independent of cost to serve, margin, etc. What's the message? There is no such thing as a bad account. Ignore that strategy stuff they were telling you about. And then some current myths about selling and salespeople. If we could get the next slide. Just 2 quick myths that I want to get across here. One is all this talk, to use the fancy terminology, about disintermediation and the death of the salesperson. It's simply not true. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Census data, in 1992, there were about 14 million people in the United States listed as salespeople. If you look at the latest data available, which is 2014, it's a little bit more than that. It's close to 15 million. Right, 1992, I use that year because nobody in this room, including me, in 1992 could spell internet or e-commerce. X years later, it's the same or a little bit more, and that in an increasingly service economy, that number is almost certainly wildly underestimated. Because as many of you know, in services firms, we don't call many salespeople salespeople. We call them associates or managing directors or vice presidents. Think about banks. Everybody's a vice president. But their job is business development. So this just isn't true. The other myth here is that selling is about personality or attitudes or a given methodology. Folks, there is good research about this, and the research indicates no consistent correlation between personality or attitudes or methods or sales performance. Talent does come in all shapes and sizes. Selling effectiveness depends upon, surprise, surprise, what you're selling and what those sales tasks are. And I want to emphasize this because one of the things that's astounded me in my career is how smart senior executives are suckers for glib generalizations about sales. It's all about relationships, or it's all about this, or it's all about that. No, it's not. It's a much more granular activity. And then, there's no such thing as effective selling if those sales behaviors are not tied to the financial and strategic goals of the company. What's required to do this better? I'm going to talk very, very briefly about 3 things. The first is, if I can go to the next slide, the first is understanding how value is created in any enterprise. All right, now I hope you all appreciate this. You're all alums here, or most of you. What I've put on this slide is what you spent 4 months suffering through in your first year finance course in business school. And I got it all on one slide, which tells you, a lot about finance. Ultimately, the goal in any business is to maximize the financial value of the enterprise. Now, how do you do that? You do that by optimizing the revenues that you get from exchanges with each customer, because that's where value is created or destroyed, right? Without customers, we don't have a business. We've got some not-for-profit, right? Minus whatever the costs are. The costs now, acquiring customers, and the costs in the future, the costs of maintaining them. Now, if you think about enterprise value that way, there are 4 ways that you affect enterprise value. You invest in projects that earn more than their cost of capital, right? That's called net present value, if you remember that. You do your best to reduce assets in activities that earn less than their cost of capital. You get out of Dodge for those sorts of projects and businesses. You try to get more from whatever are the assets you've already invested in. And then when possible, you try to reduce the firm's cost of capital itself. Now, my experience is that most senior executives, especially CEO and CFO, understand what I just said. And if they don't, they learn in a hurry the first time they're beaten up by an investor, or analyst, or the board, or something like that. What they don't get, if I could get the next slide, is how what their company is doing in sales materially affects each and every single one of these value creation levers. Why do companies invest? Basically, the most CapEx in any business is done presumably in order to make money, meaning we're going to do something that makes customers love us even more, spend more money, buy this, buy that, right? Projects and initiatives are driven by those revenue-seeking activities. Therefore, it's important where our salespeople call. Who do they consider a prospect? Who don't they? I don't know that many CEOs when I ask them, do you understand how your compensation and performance management systems and sales affect where your salespeople spend their time? I just don't. That's been my experience. In my experience, once upon a time I looked like Jimi Hendrix. My experience at this point is not that bad. Increased profits from existing capital investments. That's essentially what happens when an order is booked, right? There's a domino effect in most companies. It affects where assets are getting utilized across functions. Reduce assets in activities that earn less than the firm's cost of capital. That requires good two-way information between the way we're spending money and what is or isn't going on with customers. And my colleagues may disagree. One thing I think we've learned definitively is you can't do that only through a CRM system, right? It's management counts. And then finally, reduce the firm's cost of capital itself. Where do financing needs in most businesses come from? They come from the working capital required to conduct and/or scale the business. And the single biggest driver of cash out and cash in most businesses is the selling cycle. What's sold, how fast, and at what price. So, my point here is that this is a strategic issue, and it's a C-level concern. The next, how do you link strategy and sales in the field? A couple of ways. I think about sales productivity this way. It's a function of 3 things. The capacity of the sales force. By that I mean, feet on the street, as we would say. How many customers can they approach? And their capacity or capability. Once they're in front of a customer, what are they good for? What are they comfortable with? What do they know? What don't they know? The second variable is, do we or don't we make a sale? The close rate. And the third variable is, what kind of sale do we make? The profit per sale. Now, how do you increase sales capacity? Ultimately, by getting people to work harder and or smarter. Now, I notice when I talk to MBA groups, if I do this, they say, oh, you can't fool me. I was a Baker Scholar, as we would say at HBS. It's about working smarter. Folks, let me tell you what the research says. It is definitely also about working harder. My experience is that in the vast majority of businesses, there is a direct correlation between the number of calls and actual sales. And you know, think about those of you who are operating in global markets. You know, the Chinese work really, really hard. And the research says that's going to pay off. But it's also about working smarter, knowing your funnel in detail so that you can focus on the high impact tasks and prospects. You increase close rate by doing a better job on your opportunity selection criteria, but you need a coherent strategy to do that. And you increase profit per sale by doing all the basics well. The other element that I wanted to talk with you about, if I can go to the next slide here, is linking this, but rather than talking through this slide, I want to suggest you buy a very, very good book by a guy named Cespedes. In fact, you should the kids are going to love it. You should, get a whole bunch of them for Christmas that'll explain this. And if you do buy it, this is a genuine offer. I mean that. I think I put my email on the cover slide. If you actually read the book, send me an email. Frank, here's what made sense. Here's what didn't. I have found over the years that's the only way you can improve, if you've got that kind of feedback. If I could get the next slide, then I'll turn it back over to you, Ryan. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for showing up. I want to wish you the best in your business, but I also consider events like this, as well as networking and everything else, a little bit of professional development as well. So I also want to wish you the best in your individual careers as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, that's terrific. And I met Frank at one of our reunions. They had people with new research gave presentations, and right away I went out and did dive into it. And it is a fascinating look. People haven't looked from the CEO perspective, and so a lot of original research made me think. So thank you for that. And now I'm really excited to hand it over to Dan Weinfurter.
Thanks, Ryan. Seems like coming down on the floor is the thing to do, so I'll try to do the same. So Frank talked a bit about how important getting sales right really is for our businesses. And I want to throw a little bit of water on what's the current state of sales effectiveness in the United States today, which is the place where we have these statistics. So let's put up the first slide if we could. So the first quote is from Forrester, and most of you who are recipients of sales calls probably understand this, but 85% of the sales calls that are made on a day-to-day basis are ineffective. And so if you look back on your personal experience, you'd probably say, well, yeah, that sounds kind of right. But if you multiply 85% times 900 billion, it's a pretty scary number. And so you ask yourself, well, how can this be? So I've been in this game for a long time. I was hired into the sales training program at GE. I spent a year in training right out of college, and still, upon graduation from that program, I had really no clue what I was doing. But you sort of face the world and you make it work, or you don't. And so reasons why are varied and multifaceted, but certainly the conversation, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, is a big part of it. The sales forces in general lack the ability to understand the client's business and then be able to correctly connect the dots between the product or service and the client's business, and then importantly, the client's personal agenda in terms of how they view the world and how this decision affects his or her career and their livelihood. So that's a serious problem. Frank pointed out the level of performance is pretty dreadful. So it's one thing for a sales rep to be 90% of plan. For an enterprise to come in at 80 or 90% of plan is the difference between making a lot of money and losing a lot of money. So a 10% miss at an enterprise level is dreadful. It's really, really painful because virtually the entire revenue miss translates directly to the bottom line. And last year, I think this is captured by CSO Insights, the actual performance was 80%. A frightening statistic, which gets to another, is the number of sales reps that actually make quota. In more recent years, it's at 60%. Another way of stating it, 40% don't make plan. What happens to salespeople who don't make plan? They tend not to be around very long. One of the things that I tell people, because I've done these startups, is what is the cost of every single sales hire? And I tell people I've made the mistake many enough times to know that the number that I have come up with is correct. Each and every decision in a business-to-business complex sale is at least $1 million decision. We had one client who's in the enterprise software world, and he argued strongly with data that the real cost of every hire is $4 million, because if you get it right, compared to getting it wrong, it's a $4 million delta in revenue. And if you look at software as 95% gross margins, it translates directly to cost on the bottom line. So getting the sales decision on who to hire correct is important and not done very well. As a result, this is across the entire landscape. Turnover is at near 25% per year, meaning you turn over your entire sales organization every 4 years. If you're in a business where it takes 1 or 2 years to get traction, it's a pretty painful mistake. We did a project in the higher education world in development, which is very much like a sales role. It's a 3-year gestation period between when you meet someone and when you might get a donation. Turnover is at 40%. How well do you think that works? It's not for profit, but with those statistics, it's guaranteed to never be for profit. There's some big numbers there. And then finally, this statistic is probably the most depressing of all. 2 colleagues wrote an article in HBR that talked about the managerial hiring overall, first-level managers, and pointed out that US companies make the wrong decision 82% of the time. I'd argue that in sales management roles, it's even higher than that, because what companies tend to do is promote the best salesperson, and the best salesperson is usually not the best manager. In fact, the data would suggest that the better you are as a salesperson, the more likely you are to be a poor sales leader. Sales management is about achievement, or it's about influence. Individual selling is about achievement. And they sometimes go together, and when that happens, it's awesome, but more often than not, they're conflicting competencies. Go to the next one. So this is a chart put together by Andy Zoltners, who for a long time taught at Kellogg, and it talks about all the various levers that you have to improve sales performance. Like many things in the world, not all these levers have the same capability or potential to move the meter. Let's just pick one, for example, compensation. I would admit compensation is important. How you pay has a big influence on strategy, and it also has an influence on your cost of goods sold and SG&A. However, if you start with compensation to try to improve performance, more likely than not, it's going to have the opposite from intended result. It is likely to reduce performance. Because the good people, even if you're trying to help them, they somehow assume that you're trying to take money away, and the best people leave. Nearly every compensation program that I've seen implemented results in unintended bad consequences. So if you're trying to improve sales performance, maybe that's not where you start. Maybe pick another one. So we'd argue that 3 have the biggest ROI. The talent is the most important in the long term, but it's not immediately actionable. It takes a while to top grade a team. Getting the customer conversation, the conversation that occurs between the salesperson or the selling team and the client or prospect, has an immediate and near-term ROI, and there's a lot of opportunity there. And then finally but not least, getting the sales management to be correct is critically important. That person, if they are wrong, will destroy an effective sales team, or if they're not the right person, they'll never get it built up in the first place. So The cost of a bad first-level manager hire, because I've made this enough times wrong to know, is at least $15 million. And other firms like Xerox pointed out that each and every sales management decision was a $40 million decision. Despite all that, this is one of my pet peeves, everybody sort of understands that getting the team right is the most important process in building sales capability, but yet somehow it is still the least disciplined process in business. Even if there is a process, getting the management team to follow it and not make a decision in 30 seconds is very, very difficult. Especially so with salespeople who know the answers to every question you are going to ask. So think about that the next time you're trying to get a sales decision right. Go to the next slide. So how do you think about this? So this is the level of rigor and detail that we see frequently. Well, do we need hunter or farmers, or do we need a person who has both capabilities within the same role? So at least this is a good starting point, but the real world is far more complex than this. So let's take a look at what's really going on today in most organizations. So in most organizations, once they get to scale, the sales organization takes on much greater complexity. And the point of all of this is that there are many roles that are shown on this particular chart. But what the research would suggest is that every role for every company at every stage of the life cycle is different. It's far more complicated and requires far more rigor and analysis than most management teams actually think about. For example, what's needed for success in an early stage business is far different than what's needed for success as a business builds a brand and a reputation. I found that out the hard way. I took what I learned at GE and applied it in a startup, and I had 50% turnover. Oh, this is a little bit harder. You learn that only really A players can make it work in an early stage business. Greg, in your class, you refer to it as a renaissance seller. It's very different. And if you take what you've done in the past and apply it blindly into your current situation, it might work, but it is equally likely to not work. And if it doesn't work, it's expensive. You think about the level of capital that early stage businesses are funded with. If you make 10 mistakes, it's a fair amount of money. So applying rigor and discipline to the hiring process will yield significant results. We would suggest that if you just get the talent right, you can double revenue with no incremental headcount. And if you believe that the 80-20 rule, which we see is pervasive in nearly every business, it doesn't take a lot of work to figure out that you can, in fact, double revenue with the same level of headcount if you get the hiring decision right. For some evidence of this, look at what happened at GE when Jack Welch put in the forced ranking system in 1980 and how the performance increased between that period and 1985. It's stunning. And the reason it was done in a forced fashion is because otherwise no one would do it. It's too hard, it's too painful. People will say, well, by the time I fix this problem, I'm going to be in a different job, so I won't fix it. Now, I'm not so much an advocate of that forced ranking system, but the rigor and discipline to be realistically critical of the team that you have in place, that's a lesson that is worth learning and acting on, because it really changes the trajectory of a company. So I won't spend much time on this. This is just to point out that as you go from large business to enterprise selling, the curve gets really steep. So a person who can do really well in a small or medium business sale or a simple, less complex environment, they may or may not be able to make the leap to a larger enterprise sale or a sale of increasing complexity. It's an exponential difference between the two. And to really think through what you're going to need is critically important, and many people don't actually take the time to get that right, and as a result, they fail to move up the curve. So we spent some time talking about talent. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on messaging, and then this will feed into what Craig's going to talk about. So our experience is that most people are pretty good about talking about their products and services. That's what we're trained to do. It's less important today with all the information you can get on the internet, but it still matters. You still need a sales force that is equipped to understand what you do and how it can solve a business problem for a client. What sales organizations in general are less good at is really uncovering what's going on, what's the problem that can be solved that's obvious, what's the less obvious problem, what does it mean if we solve that problem, and then being able to connect the dots between the pain and the potential gain that a client has and products and services. We see this with traditional B2B sales organizations, but it also exists in professional services especially. And it's interesting there because people that are highly technical, they tend to overestimate their sales capability because they can answer all the technical questions. And they spend time talking about the technical solution. And if you then go back and ask people, well, what's really important to the client? I don't know. I didn't ask that problem. I didn't ask that question. And both actually have to occur. You do need to know how the solution can be solved, but you actually have to go back and connect the dots with what's really going on organizationally, but also personally, because people make decisions on how it affects them personally, and then back into that in terms of what's the business decision. So Craig will pick up on this as we go forward, but getting that right is really, really important. So just a quick thing to think of. There's 4 questions up here that seem really easy. What do you do for your customers or your clients? What do you do that's different? What do you do that's better? And what are your proof points? These seem like really simple questions, but my experience is when you ask 5 people in a company these 4 questions, you will have some version of 20 different answers. It's really, really difficult to get this set up so that it can be developed and delivered with precision across an entire organization. Tailored to the buyer, tailored to the product or service, and with an understanding of what really matters to that particular client. If you can get this right, get this conversation right, you can literally improve the revenue per salesperson by 30% in the current year. It's very, very hard to do though. I was at a big insurance company doing a kickoff talk, and they had spent millions of dollars on the messaging and trying to get this right. So we said, well, this should be pretty easy. We'll have everybody at each table representing each region answer these 4 questions. Should take 5 minutes. 30 minutes later, the group was still arguing and didn't have any of these questions really answered. The VP of sales was completely blown away that all that time and effort, and they still couldn't actually answer these particular questions. I saw people in Craig's class struggle with a similar exercise, and I'm sure he'll spend some time talking about that. Next slide. So this is the last of mine. So these are some metrics that tend to make what you're thinking about measurable. So for each business, it's different, but it's worthwhile to pick a few that you think are really big drivers of your business, and then try to say, well, what's the industry standard? Can we do it better? For most of these, there's data out there and research that would suggest what's best in class, and it's possible to look at what you're doing in your business, calibrate it against these, and then set a path forward, and you usually can calculate the return on investment. Bain would suggest that if you are successful in a sales improvement or sales transformation project, you can improve enterprise EBITDA by 25%, which is a pretty big number. Our statistics would be directionally consistent with that. Despite all that, this is part of our pet peeve, is there's huge upside in getting this right. There's a ton of money spent, yet for whatever reason, we still have performance standards that lag nearly every other discipline. So in the finance world, this level of performance wouldn't be tolerated. In product management, it wouldn't be. In engineering, it wouldn't be. But for some reason in sales, these dreadful performance statistics are unchanged for the last 30 years. And how can that be? It's the fact that, by and large, business does not yet look at sales as a discipline in the same way that they do finance, engineering, operations, et cetera. And so part of our mission in the world is to change that. So thanks for being here tonight. We'll have a chance to talk more.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. And we're very excited, having gone Harvard, Kellogg. Now we have Booth is in the house, Craig Wortmann. And Professor Wortmann, take it away.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I'm not last because Booth is third, okay? Let's just get that clear right off the bat. I'm privileged to be here with this crew. And I'm delighted to be down in this territory, 25, so very similar to Dan. Dan and I and Frank and I are closely aligned on everything we're talking about tonight. But I loved Dan's introduction because it reminded me that I'm actually in my IBM territory from 25 years ago. So I had 13 zip codes on the south side of Chicago, walking around terrified and clueless in this very neighborhood, trying to sell AS400s to manufacturers.
The infamous south side of Chicago?
I spoke at Google today and I said AS400 and they were like, what is that?
Oh, I see.
I want to thread a couple pieces. I want to try to thread all of this together, and I'm going to do it very, very quickly. I think I have 4 slides or something, and I think they're mostly pictures. So Frank started us off really well talking about the connection between strategy and sales. And the reason we put me last is if you start there and you are compelled by Frank's argument, which I would argue you should be, that we need to do a better job connecting strategy and sales. And then you add Dan's piece, which is the thing I take away from Dan's piece always when I see him talk is rigor and discipline. So if that's true, that we need to be really good at connecting strategy and sales, and then here we need to insert in our sales leaders and salespeople rigor and discipline, then I like to ask the question, well, how do we do that? I have a take on this. I don't know if it's thorough and exactly right, but we decided 8 years ago to develop a very, very tactical class at Chicago Booth called Entrepreneurial Selling. We've had a hell of a lot of fun with it, and it really gets down to an inch above the ground. And what I mean by that is my class is designed all around building a sales toolkit to deliver, to carry through the strategy with rigor and discipline every time you talk to a customer. So what I always say to my students, and it puts some of my students off, to be honest, where I say in the first 5 minutes of the class, about a 30-hour MBA class, welcome to the only class at Booth that is a contact sport. Because sales is not in here, nothing in this room, it's outside this building. When you walk into a customer's office, what are you going to say? What are the words you're going to say? What are the order? What are the impact questions you're going to ask? That's having rigor and discipline. And so I thought what I would do, if it's okay with all of you, I'm asking for forgiveness, not permission, is to talk about something very, very tactical. Why? Because I think it's one of the most powerful tools that your salespeople can use, and if you can get it in their heads and get it in their hearts, they'll use it. And just for fun, since we're all here together, and you've given us the great honor to come here tonight, this may be over-promising right off the bat, I think it's actually something that you all can use, in fact, you already do, which is the ability, with discipline and skill, to tell the right story at the right time for the right reasons, okay? This solves a very important communications problem. One of the things that sales leaders, salespeople, and everybody sitting in this room needs to be able to do is to influence people by telling them a story. I'm going to spend 5 minutes, 7 minutes building a case for story, and then we'll wrap this up and let you get in with questions. Sound good? Okay, let's have the first. Oh, there it is. This is you. This is us. We are awash in a rushing river of information. It's coming at us from many, many different sources. Those sources are increasing all the time. Across the top, you have the traditional forms of information, books, TV, this, right? This is upper left, right? What we're doing right now. And then on the bottom, you have some of the new digital forms of information. You got your smartphones, you got your iPads. What's that in the lower right? I was just there today. It was kind of fun. Google Glass. Anybody ever wore Google Glass? I know they discontinued it. Anybody, you did? You wore that around? I wore it around for a day. It made me a little nauseated, actually. And I'm a little too old to do it, but it was super fun. I love experimenting. The reason I leave it on this slide is not because I'm lazy and I haven't taken it off my dumb slide. It's because it makes my point exactly, one of my points. This is a problem, right? Google Glass, in whatever form it ultimately takes, is coming. You know it's coming, right? It's going to happen that we can record every experience we have. My point with this is we are awash in information. It is surrounding us all the time, and it's increasing, not decreasing. And if you go to the next slide, this is you, this is your mom. This is where your mom got information, right? This is where your mom got information. She had all the traditional forms 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but she had none of these bottom ones. Now, this begs a very important question. Was your mom, due to lack of information, completely unable to function in business and society? Some of you are like, yeah, pretty much, right? No, she wasn't. But yet, here we are, the slide back, we're awash in this information, right? What do you give up when you get another social profile? LinkedIn, Twitter, Google, and nothing against technology, guys, don't misunderstand me. I love all this stuff. I wore Google Glass around for a day because I wanted to learn how it works, right? I love this stuff. I check LinkedIn all the time. But what do you give up when you get another device or another social channel or another information feed? What do you give up? You have to give something up because you weren't doing Facebook yesterday, but today you are. Time, sanity, I like that one. Time, sanity, human relationships, privacy. What is it? Attention. Yes, sir? You lose your message. Anybody scared yet? Does that bother anybody? Time? Human relationships? Here's the deal, guys. If we're going to add rigor and discipline to deliver the strategy, you got to have the right tools to do this. One of the most important and powerful tools you can do is to tell a story. Now, if you would go to the next one, please. This is my final exam here. Annette Simmons is a woman who looks at, I love this woman. She has a fantastic book, and if you're interested in this topic, when we all break for a glass of wine, I'm happy to give you a reference to her book. It's called The Story Factor. Not quite as important as these gentlemen's books, but it's a great book. She looks at the impact of different forms of information on people's decision making, which is another way of talking about sales, right? So I'm going to put my teacher hat on for a second. Read this quote and tell me whether you agree or disagree with Annette Simmons. I'll give you a second. Just get through it. Okay. I will only do this to you once. Raise your hand if you agree with Annette Simmons. Raise it up high so I can see it. Okay, fantastic. Put your hands down. Raise your hand if you disagree with Annette Simmons. Okay, there's 2 of you and a half, 3 of you. Not all of you voted. You know we're in Chicago, right? You vote as many times as you want in Chicago. We're very proud of that for those of you who are out of town. Okay, so the vast majority of you agree with this. Why do you agree? People stick with their story even when presented with facts that don't fit. They're facts. It's the objective truth. What the hell? Why do you agree with this? Now I'm ranting at you, so nobody's going to answer. Why do you agree? We're all biased. We talk about this in the business school, right? We have selection bias. Help me, gentlemen. Availability bias, confirmation bias.
Ignorance bias.
Ignorance bias. Cognitive dissonance. Self-interest. Pride. Okay, all of these things, right? Right. You think these things work for you. Dan said this, guys, in a different form. Technical people who are deep on product knowledge often communicate in facts. I'm going to try to make this very real. You have a high-stakes meeting tomorrow from 11 o'clock to 11 in the morning to 12. I'm just making this up. You all have a high-stakes meeting. You have to walk into that physical space with someone sitting there, and you have to impact their decision-making. You have to convince them, persuade them, i.e. sell them, on a new way of thinking, doing, spending resources, time, or money, whatever, right? The question I'm asking you is when you hit their door frame, what's the best form of information you can have at your disposal? Annette Simmons is suggesting stories, right? Not facts. In 1997, 3 researchers, 2 women and a man, walked into the Carnegie Mellon Undergrad Student Center at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. These are undergrads, so they're 18 to 22. And they said to these young people, you know, you young people, you have such interesting uses of technology. We're very curious about how you use technology. We'd like to march you down to this separate room, and we want to conduct a survey on how you use technology. It'll take 6 or 8 minutes of your time, and for your trouble, we'll give you $5. So these young people, you know, they've done this experiment 100 times. They all march down to this separate thing. You know, they're seeing a beer in their immediate future. So they march down, and they spend 6 minutes taking the survey. And 2 friends, undergrads, Frank and Dan, walk out. And Frank says to Dan, he says, he's holding his envelope with his $5. He says, hey, Dan, did you give any money to Save the Children and Rokia? And Dan looks, he's holding his envelope with his $5. He looks at his friend Frank, and he says, I gave some money to Save the Children, but what's Rokia? I don't understand what that means. And Frank says, Dan, in my envelope with my $5, there was a pledge form from Save the Children. And it told the story of a 9-year-old girl called Rokia. And she's dying of a waterborne illness. And it's entirely treatable, blah, 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 Save the Children. So Frank says to Dan, so I gave some money. Did you give some money? And Dan says to his friend Frank, that's funny because in my envelope with my $5, there was also a pledge form from Save the Children. My pledge form said, in Malawi, Africa, on an annual basis, there are 9 million cases of waterborne illness. There are 11 million cases of malaria. They're all entirely treatable, blah, 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 Save the Children. And Dan says to Frank, so I gave some money too. This was not an experiment about technology. That was a ruse. That was cover for the actual research, which is the impact of fact versus story in animating people's decisions, otherwise known as selling. So what happened? Just really a fun thing to share, just a detail. They gave 5 $1 bills. That's just wicked smart. How much, so Dan, you got the facts, right? Dan got the facts. How much money did Dan's cohort give? Take a guess. $1? $1? We're auctioning. You'd be right, $1.14, you're close. People have loose change, their purses, their pockets. How about Frank? 5? 10? You're optimistic, and I dig that about you. You're wrong, but you're optimistic. $2.38. Guys, that's more than double. If the Chicago booth guy can do the math, that's more than double. Right? Why does that happen? Why? You said it. You nailed it. First time. Most people say because it's personal. That's true, but dig down. You got to dig. High-performing salespeople help people feel. Your feelings is what animates your emotions. We know this. A guy at Princeton named Daniel Kahneman, you've probably heard of his most recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't read it, add it to your list. It's a classic. He taught us through 5 decades of research that we make most of the decisions we make, 90-ish%, in our unconscious mind. It's hard for business people to get their heads around this. Kahneman has proven this. He won the Nobel Prize, right? We make most of our decisions in our unconscious. What stories do is they have 2 pieces of DNA that other forms of information do not have, especially facts. Emotion and context. They connect to emotion and they add context. And great salespeople, Dan mentioned to us, and he's exactly right. Salespeople, the first thing they probably did with you at GE, the first thing that IBM, and I love IBM, tremendously blessed to be at IBM, they open our heads and they dump information in, product knowledge. And it's only that we only get good at selling, we become high performers when we internalize that knowledge and we live in the question, and then we use that knowledge of the buyer to tell them stories to animate their decision making. Does this make sense? Okay, last one. I think I got one more. A guy named, his name is slipping my mind. A guy got really interested, I'll think of his name in a second, got really interested in why this Save the Children research works. Why does this work? He got very curious, and he did a really clever and kind of funny experiment. He went around to garage sales and yard sales in the United States. He bought 300 items, all between $1 and $2 in value. So he bought a toy, he bought a cigarette lighter at a garage sale, he bought all this stuff. He created a list of bullet-pointed features of this. It's a cigarette lighter. He bought a 3-ounce jar of mayonnaise. I'm not making this up. He said it's 3 ounces, it's made by Kraft, it's unopened, hopefully, whatever those bullet points were. And he put those 300 items on eBay. And then he took the exact same 300 items, he sent a picture of each item to an amateur writer and had them write a 1-paragraph narrative about each item, otherwise known as a story. Put them on eBay, sold them. Guess what the difference in price was, and it wasn't 2 times. Guess what the difference in price was? 2,700%. The jar of mayonnaise sold for $51. I am not making this up, right? Stories have tremendous power, and I said right at the outset, and I'll stop, it's a favorite subject of mine, they have tremendous power. You already do this. But connecting it back to my amazing colleagues here, If you have the strategy, that's the launch pad for having stories. If you have rigor and discipline, now what you're doing and what you're telling your salespeople to do, and I hope you tell them tomorrow, or your portfolio companies, you should call the VPs of sales and say, what you need to do, here's the metaphor, guys, is you need to have a quiver of arrows on your back. You need to collect these stories. They have tremendous power. Because if you agree with anything that I've just said, or you agree with Annette Simmons, or the tremendous amount of research from Kahneman and other people that this is actually true, then here's the bad news, folks, and here's why I teach at a business school. Then you have to do it. You got to get about the effort of collecting stories, categorizing your stories, polishing them, sharpening them, putting them in your quiver, such that you can pull the yellow arrow out when you need it, the green arrow out when you meet somebody else, the red arrow out when somebody's technical, when somebody's a CEO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to have the stories first. And I'm hoping that gives you a sense of one of the many sales tools that we need to equip these folks with to deliver our strategies with rigor and discipline. Thanks a lot. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Dan,
Thank you, Craig. That was fantastic. And so now we're going to open it up for Q&A. And I thought while you guys are getting your questions ready, I thought I would start off here. You know, we're talking a lot about, how do you get from strategy to execution? And we talked about the sales force as being one of the most important groups, the most expensive groups towards execution. And Frank, I think in your book you had the term, I loved it, strategy priests and sales sinners. And I'd love to get your take on, let's assume we get the alignment right, and let's assume we, everything that Dan and Craig are talking about are the right things to do. What are some advice for sort of the strategy priests, many of which I'm guessing are us, sort of the C-suite folks? How do we actually get the sellers to execute, assuming there is alignment? Because there is a behavior and an analytical component, and in my experience in running businesses, that's where the golf is, and it's hard to go from academically what's right to actually getting them to actually do it. So I'd love your take on that.
Well, first, let me explain. Is this one working? Yeah. Let me explain the origin of the strategy priest. It actually comes General Electric. Did some consulting work with them for years, and I always remember being at a business review, and the fellow who at the time was the CMO was giving this big talk about cross-selling this and cross-selling that, and as someone who worked there, you'll know the type I'm talking about. One of those craggy sort of LOB heads at GE circa 1988 leaned over to me and he said, "This guy's one of our strategy priests. He operates where the rubber meets the sky." All right? So to answer your question, I'd say two things. And like any dialogue, it has to work on both. One is, if you're a senior executive, you got to get out there. I'm amazed how many senior executives really believe that big data is going to allow them to know what is really going on. And that's a myth. It is. If you look at companies that have at least 1,000 employees, each and every single one of them already has in its CRM system more data than in the entire United States Library of Congress. That's a fact. So, is the issue going to be more data? No, it's going to be staying in touch with what's going on out there. Then once you're out there, for me, the three things, and I think Dan, I agree with him here 300%. Hiring in sales is extraordinarily sloppy. There is research, and this is real research that's been replicated many times, that says many, many companies are better off, literally when they hire, picking resumes at random than going through the process they go through now. That's how bad it is. The flip side of that is the opportunity to improve. The second for me, and again, Dan alluded to this, I'm with you, I'm not, even though I grade on a forced ranking system, I'm not convinced it's the best, but the single most underutilized lever for getting better performance in companies, in my experience, is performance reviews, especially in sales. Salespeople don't like them. What's Willie Loman's constant advice to his sons in Death of a Salesman? It's important to be well-liked, Biff. The jargon for that in social science is affiliation needs. It is very high in sales. They don't like to give bad news, especially face-to-face, right? One of the oldest aphorisms in sales, win an argument, lose a sale. But it's important, and sales managers, to use a technical term, generally stink at this. And then the third is you better make sure you got the right metrics. I can tell you this, in most businesses, sheer volume is not correlated with enterprise value, and yet that's how salespeople are paid. So those would be the three things, and I'm with Dan. That's where the leverage is in most companies. I don't know if others want to.
I don't have anything to add.
Let's open it up a little bit. Amy here has a microphone for those of you. Maybe I know this crowd's not shy.
Thanks, Amy. I think about the global demographic research done by companies like Manpower over the last 10 years, presented at the World Economic Forum and other places, and I've always been startled to find that sales talent is always in the top 10 shortages, with nuclear engineers and other key engineering roles, and sales sticks out on that list. Do we think that tolerance of sales underperformance is relative to the shortage of sales talent?
I'll maybe take a crack at that. So historically, sales has not been taught at the undergraduate level at all. It's beginning to change. There's now 107 schools that teach sales as either a certificate.
But that's 107 out of 4,500.
Yeah, still dreadful. However, those that actually go through training or education in sales at an undergraduate level perform dramatically better than those that have, say, a liberal arts degree and come out and come into a company. There are very few organizations that do what I was the benefit of, where you go through a training course for a year. I mean, it's almost non-existent today. IBM did it, Xerox did it, GE did it, but today, if you get a couple weeks, you're lucky. And it's a very, very difficult occupation, which requires a ton of skill and requires training as well. So, but there's hope on the horizon as more people get trained. And then I think some of the online vehicles will also help.
Can I just comment? So, just a quick addition of something I just learned. In his introduction, Ryan mentioned that we just launched this online course, and we're right at the beginning, folks, so I don't want to overstate this, but 4 weeks in, you realize it hits you like a ton of bricks how powerful the web is. You got thousands of people piling in this thing. What's interesting about some of the online platforms, I know Coursera best just because that's where we have our agreement. They're a really interesting crew of people out in San Francisco, and what they just told me, I didn't realize, I knew through my associate with these guys and just some of my own homework that, like you said, this gentleman said, sales is a profession that is underserved. What is interesting, and I hope cautiously optimistic, is that the web-based platforms are getting people piling in saying, why aren't we doing more stuff related to sales? And Coursera, for one, did sort of a ranking, and they said of the 14 top professions that have the most energy worldwide, meaning the most demand for education, number 1, software engineer. Number 2, sales professional. So I hope, I don't know what to make of that, folks, I just learned that, but I'm hoping that that increases the school count from 107, and we get pulled into it by folks like the online communities and stuff like that, people worldwide sort of voting with their clicks.
Yeah, but if I could add to that, and again, there's a wonderful, at Harvard, we've got this US competitiveness study, exactly the same results. And Mike Porter at Strategy Guru called me up about this when they got the research back, like, Frank, is this true? It also turns out that if you want to improve the standard of living in the United States, sales jobs for the vast majority of the middle class is the way to do it. But I'd make 2 comments. One is, Dan's point is that unlike most other professions, there's no place to hunt for the most part. It's not like, if you're hiring an engineer, let me go to Kellogg and see who's an engineering major. If I want finance, who is an undergraduate finance major? That doesn't exist. That said, If you wait for universities to solve this problem, you're waiting for Godot. There's still an ongoing management requirement here, 25 to 30% annual turnover. You're not going to get that out of the undergraduate level. You gotta manage it. You can't talk about talent management and ignore a skill gap of that magnitude. Otherwise, all you're doing is talking.
Hi, Craig. So you said that the storytelling was really a tactical issue, but don't you think that that should be incorporated more into the C-level management strategy?
I do. I mean, it begins there. It has to, what I tend to work like these guys, sort of up and down the ladder, and I always say to CEOs or executive committees, this begins with you. You need to walk out of your strategy retreat at Kohler, Wisconsin, and you need to come back with the stories. And then those stories cascade through an organization. My first business actually was a software company trying to help push out stories. We did an okay job. But it was really about, you're exactly right. It doesn't begin and end with the salespeople. It's just because that's your feet on the street, your face to the market, whatever metaphor you want to use, they're the ones that, where the decision making is happening. But if you come out of the Kohler, Wisconsin woods with a 95-page deck on your 5-year strategy, and you don't translate that into something tangible like stories, and guys, stories is only one of the tools. We create hundreds of these sales tools. The ability to ask impact questions, the ability to work a room, the art of the sales conversation, these are all tools. That strategy has to get translated into that. So yes is the short answer. Thanks, Amy.
Running my heels on all the way over here.
Thank you. I had a question about inside sales, which is a very hot topic in a lot of the sales organizations. Do you see inside sales as being fundamentally different from other sales or the type of sales that you've been talking about? And if we think about creating a ladder of development for sales professionals, does it make sense to have someone come in as an inside salesperson and then develop their skills and go into more of that executive, high-level selling? And what does an organization have to do to be able to support someone through that process?
I'll start on this, but I know Ryan has a point of view as well, because it's a big part of what Vista's doing with their portfolio companies. So the world is certainly changing, and there's an increasing emphasis on deploying inside sales to take over much of what today is being done with outside sales. Now, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, you could probably argue it either way, but the desire is to move more selling to a lower cost model where there's evidence that people can sell fairly complex goods and services over the phone. That all said, as I pointed out on that one chart, someone could be a very effective inside sales professional, and they may or they may not have the skill, the innate DNA to move to an outside sales role in a task of very complex requirements. And so, but the good news is you can measure that, and you can develop people, and a good number of them will be able to make the transition from inside sales to outside sales, and it's a worthwhile undertaking because you have a pretty good idea what you have as you move them from one role to the next. Same is true of sales management. It typically requires someone to be good at selling to be an effective manager, but the danger is just because they're great at selling doesn't make them a terrific manager.
I mean, I would agree with that. I'd also say we're kind of redefining inside sales. I mean, the reality is buyers want information digitally before they access kind of humans. And so we almost need a new word for it, because when people hear inside sales, they think, usually small market, folks that are closing. It's almost like a virtual sales. In fact, I was on a call with one of our CEOs today where we're actually going to call it like the VP of the hub. What I mean by that is every seller now has a massive virtual component to what they do, because it's not their decision. While Vista, a private equity firm, would like to lower customer acquisition costs, that's actually not what's driving it. It's a buyer-driven shift that is not our decision. And so the reality is, if you're not where the buyers are, and if you're not telling your stories in ways they want to hear them, And so what's happening is we're redefining the whole world of selling, where there's a whole virtual component that everybody has to get good at. And it's a huge shift to what we call high velocity digital marketing and sales machine. And that's really what we're spending a lot of time on, because sales and marketing is starting to blur in the upfront part of the buyer process, right? And so if you know the buyers want to go to things more digitally, you better have those digital assets. Take TIPCO. We own TIPCO. It's it's about $1 billion integration business. They sell things, 7-figure type deals. We are starting to sell $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 deals, all not online, but through virtual means without face-to-face meetings, because that's what buyers more and more want. 2 years ago, when I was running a sales training firm, I closed a $400,000 sales initiative on text with a 28-year-old chief of staff of a Fortune 500 company. And I'm like, dude, this doesn't work this way. Like, I have to come meet you and pitch you. He's like, I went to your website, I went on LinkedIn, I called 4 of your clients without you knowing it. They said you were great. We trust you. Let's just go. Give me the contract. And I was like, whoa, no, I got to come do the pitch. But so whether we like it or not, the world, the buyers want more digital. Now, that being said, I think you're going to see a bigger shift. If you look at a sales force, that might have, if you have 500 sellers now and 400 of them are outside and 100 are inside, I think you're going to see just more of the skills being more virtually run. That does not mean that the outside sellers are going away. It just means that their profile is shifting to much more analytical, almost a consultant role. Because think about things that you buy. If you're going to meet a seller, you don't want to hear about stuff you already figured out online. You want them to tell how are you going to connect what is it they're selling to a business problem that you have. So it's a whole different level of skill set. So that's why the things Craig's are talking, they better be able to communicate the story powerfully. And everything Dan's talking about, you better have that rigor and discipline to have those right people. And especially the talent profiles Dan's talking about, sort of the sellers that we know, frankly. I'm in my mid-40s, and I have sort of a stereotype of what a good seller was, having been one 20 years ago. It's not that person anymore. It's a much different introverted, analytical type, almost a consultant. So, long rambling answer, but that was a great question.
Yeah, but I'd like to just add a few things. One is I want to emphasize something Ryan said. Usually, the data is the data. Inside sales, since the Great Recession started, has increased much, much more than other sales organizations for obvious reasons. Lower your costs, and also all these college graduates looking for jobs. Well, I'm going to start as an SDR. And some firms, to your question, do use it as training. But if the issue is, well, I can sell it over the phone, Alexander Graham Bell is older than anybody on this stage. The issue is, do you have the right system, the content marketing, the other digital media that Ryan is talking about? Secondly, I think what you see going on now is that playbook is getting bigger and richer as it migrates out of SMB businesses. And the good news is we now have lots of data, and we're going to get much, much more about how to analyze the sales funnel and where this works and where I use the field person where it counts. And the third thing is, watch out what you wish for. If you look right now at most inside sales organizations, think about the SaaS businesses that we were talking about. We used to call that in financial services the boiler room. These are basically people spending 8 hours a day, literally making one call every 3 minutes, and then the software leaves the automated voicemail system. There are limits to what's developed in that job. But it's a much more, it's here to stay. It's not like, it's just a fad.
Dan, this question is for you. I run an inside sales company, kind of interesting. What are the characteristics, as you look at the characteristics of a salesperson, what do you think of the key attributes for a salesperson are? And I would tell you, I think an undying positive attitude is. What's your response to that?
I'll give you a quick answer, and it's not meant to be a smug answer, but it depends. It depends on the role. It depends on the company. It depends on the product. It depends on the service. It depends on who they're selling to. So you can't answer the question in a sort of generic sense. Every sales role, even if it's inside sales, is different, is my view. Now, there are some common characteristics that tend to correlate with success, but I think, are taking great risk if you run to the bank with this general list and don't calibrate it for the role in particular. So that's my quick answer.
I'll give you, having worked with hundreds and hundreds of sellers, one thing I will leave you with, if you are looking, I agree with Dan, there's a lot of role specialization, and when you look at people that you want to be the closer role, to me, the interview question you can always ask, I don't know if you guys agree, what do you like about sales? And if in 2 seconds they don't talk about winning, competing, the hunt, you know that person's not a closer. If they talk about relationships and I love the customer, blah, 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 that person's never going to close a thing. So that's my 2 cents. I don't know. That's free advice. I always add that interview question.
Coffee is for closers.
Yeah, coffee is for closers. Well, listen. You know, it's 7:30. We have this amazing venue for another hour, and you know, Frank and Dan and Craig are going to stay up here to answer some questions. You can come up. And Treehouse Private Equity is generously offered, and GrowthPlay has sponsored some cocktails. And then you can go to the museum. There's a lot of really cool cars, and so we'll be here for the next hour or so. So I just want to formally thank all of you for coming. Thank you so much to Frank Cespedes, Dan Weinfurter, and Craig Wortmann. We really appreciate all the insight and the research and just doing this to be nice. It's really great. Thank you to the Harvard Business School Club, the University of Chicago Booth Club, and the Kellogg Alumni Club. We really appreciate it, and mostly Treehouse Private Equity and GrowthPlay for sponsoring it. So thank you all for coming, and please enjoy some cocktails and cars.